It's almost impossible to imagine that the Night Lords were once a loyalist Space Marine legion. Remembrancers of the Great Crusade recorded that the 8th Legion was soaked in blood and madness since its birth. They were warriors created to ensure that the conquered worlds of the new Imperium always stayed in line, and they did this through terror and violence. They were true villains since their inception, given free reign to act as monsters and demons that would scare entire worlds into submission. The Night Lords truly represented the Emperor's wickedness, a vile side that all humans possessed, but one that was seldom let loose. Imperial savants gather that after witnessing the savagery of the Unification War, and knowing that countless vicious warlords held power over the scattered human colonies, the Emperor's intentions for his sons were a simple one. He required the Night Lord's cruelty to drag the barbaric empires of the Age of Strife into his glorious Empire of Light. To complement the Night Hunter's sadistically cunning gene seed, the Emperor chose the prison sinks of ancient Terra as a recruitment source for the 8th Legion. In vast caverns filled with half-crushed ruins of millennia, there lived men and women who had transgressed against the laws of their masters. Condemned never to see the light again or breathe free air, they lived out their lives in fear and blind darkness. There was no law in these lightless lands, and survival existed only by the blade's edge. Only the strongest and most ruthless survived in these subterranean warrens, and those who did grew in cruelty and cunning. Fed by a constant influx from the hive cities above, the prison sinks were an ever-hungering gate to madness and murder. With millions of prisoners trapped under the massive hive cities of humanity's homeworld, it wasn't long before prison gangs developed dark and brutal societies where infighting was common, and when victory was achieved, the most valuable spoils of battle were women and weapons. Amongst the bloodshed and rape, children were born, cradled in the dark and raised amongst death. Those who lived over a standard decade were pale, silent creatures who adapted themselves to move without making a sound. In these grim-filled corridors, these little ones killed without remorse. To them, an enemy's death represented an achievement that brought them another day. The prisoners called them the Night's Children, and for those not born in the prison sinks, these murderers were a terror to encounter. It was from these pale children that the Emperor of Mankind would create the first warriors of the 8th Legion. Dour, with skin so pale it resembled ash or powdered bone, they were far from their brother legionnaires in manner and appearance. The gene seed of the 8th Legion had been well paired with this human stock, and if anything, it seemed as if one had been made with the other in mind. Besides accentuating their paleness, the gene seed gave the sons of the underworld the ability to see through darkness to a degree that far exceeded that of a regular Astarte. This gift was also a curse, forcing them to see the light of suns and stars through filters and flare buffers. Even though they now walked in the light of the world above, the warriors of the 8th Legion always walked in darkness. The first use that the Emperor found for his 8th Legion was to bring to heel those that believed that the sins of the past could live on in this newborn Imperium of Man. Several of those who had bent their knee to the Emperor had done so because they believed that it was their only choice. Others had seen the empires of the techno-barbarian warlords rise and fall, believing that the Imperium of Man was also just a temporary arrangement. Crimes against the new order of the Imperium took many faces, from the Saragon enclaves whose gene atrocities continued in secret, to the psych breeding of the court of Antaeus and the March of the 10 Million. They all showed that even in the face of the Emperor's might, some would fall back into the ways of the old knight. When such crimes required not simply crushing, but retribution, the Emperor deployed the 8th Legion. Such actions seemed well suited for the 8th Legion, whether as a consequence of their genetic inheritance or a combination of their origins and indoctrinations. The warriors of the 8th seemed to have tended towards moral absolution and a drive to enact retribution. There were no shades of gray for the Night Lord's moral universe, no degree of guilt or innocence. Truth and falsehood was as day is to night, invisible and unqualified. The dark was the realm of guilt, lies, and monsters. Those who dwelt in the dark knew only the language of blood, the message of swift and merciless retribution to their actions. Justice brought the light of darkness, and justice was neither warm nor caring, but as indifferent and cold as the edge of a knife. This inherited ideology was strange for a Space Marine Legion. It was clear that the Emperor created the Night Lords as warriors of darkness that were meant to infiltrate and fight a war for a future of pure light. But by doing so, they would create an empire that wouldn't allow them to exist. Like the Thunder Warriors of the Unification War, the Night Lords were a means to an end, and once the crusade was complete, their purpose would become obsolete. it was apparent that other Space Marine legions would easily maintain compliance, and the need for terror and shock in a galaxy controlled by the Imperial truth would be no more. Once we understand how the false Emperor clearly poisoned his sons with pure evil for his own selfish agenda, it's not difficult to sympathize with the Night Lord's betrayal. In a way, the Corpse Emperor planted the seed of his own demise within this Legion of Darkness. Now there are some clearer minds that understand that the role of the Night Lords would never truly end, for the galaxy was filled with darkness, and it could never be fully illuminated. And just like humans, every empire needs a little bit of malice. If the Night Lords would have never taken the side of the traitor Horus during the Horus Heresy, perhaps the loyalist Night Lords would be one of the Imperium's most powerful weapons against the enemies of mankind. Using their own unholy tactics against them, the Night Lords would terrorize Xeno raiders from even thinking about harming humanity. They would stalk the streets of the Imperium and prey on the cultists who wished to follow a path of darkness, and they would punish the mutant for defiling the purity of the human form. And these defensive actions were recorded during the early years of the Great Crusade, when rebellions and conspiracies were common. One of these famous events is recorded in Imperial history as the Castigation of Venori. During the early years of the Great Crusade, alliances and oaths were still fresh, untested, and half-formed. Even as the Imperium extended beyond the Sol system, the domains left in its wake were often of questionable stability and loyalty. Attempted rebellions and conspiracies were common, but the Imperium usually put most of these insurrections down swiftly and without fanfare. However, occasionally a few rebellions required a different response, not simply subjugation, but retribution. Venori was a naturally fortified Terran city enclave built into the walls of a series of chasms that had once been part of the Pan-Pacific Empire. Venori had been one of the last of the tyrant Narthan Doom's domains to fall under the War of Unification. The people of Venori did not take easy to the imperial yoke, as they submitted to the Emperor's rule in reluctant silence. This changed, however, with the coming of the Crimson Walkers, a cabal of psychers, gene splicers, and warlords who had once served the last great Terran tyrants of the Age of Strife. Bit by bit, they gathered followers and resources, spreading a secret web across Terra. The center of this resurgence was Venori. It seemed the Crimson Walkers were determined to pull a part of Terra back into the nightmare of the recent past. When the Emperor heard of the rise of this reborn threat, he is said to have spoken 3 words: "Send the Eighth." The Eighth Legion, which would later become the Night Lords, did not respond right away, as its force within the Sol system at that time only numbered a little more than 500 warriors, a large force of Astartes, but not one that could overwhelm a city of millions. When the 8th Legion began their campaign of fear, it started with an orbital bombardment falling from the night sky, which lasted for 6 solar hours. Following the bombardment, the artificial darkness remained. Soon a heavy downpour, thick with chemicals, rained upon the millions of fearful inhabitants from the seeded clouds above. The 8th Legion arose from the abyss on jets of flame, butchering any who crossed their path. The screams of terror and battle echoed through their drug-weakened minds. The Crimson Walkers responded by unleashing an army of mutant monstrosities, but still the 8th Legion came on, slicing abominations apart with lightning-sheathed claws. They screamed with the voice of the dead as they fought, their speaker grills shouting out the recorded sounds of suffering, pain, and loss. When the chasms were blazing like the mouth of the mythical hell, the drop pods fell. The reinforcement converged on the chasm, cutting their way through the city sprawl, killing any they found. Soon, the remaining Crimson Walkers faced their doom fragmented, harrowed, and cut off from one another, until they were cornered by the figures in midnight-clad blue power armor. Those who reached the blasted borders surrounding the city found themselves hunted by the 8th Legion seeker squads. It is said that the 8th Legion allowed many to run before hunting them down through the long hours of artificial night, maiming but never killing, until dragging their broken quarry back to the chasm. With Venori screaming and burning, the 8th Legion performed their last duty. Alive and healed so that they were conscious, they threw the Crimson Walkers into the chasm. Then they detonated charges along the cliff edge, severing the hanging city from the cliff face. The screams of 10 millions who had sheltered from the fighting in the cliff-bound buildings reached up to the sky, as they followed the Crimson Walkers into the black depths of the earth. The 8th Legion left the decimated city before the dawn came again, cementing their reputation for the use of fear and terror as effective weapons of Imperial retribution and control. The Imperium's need for the violence that the Night Lords inherently displayed will always be questioned by Imperial savants. Nevertheless, the one thing we cannot question is that at one point, the Night Lords were a loyalist Space Marine Legion. But yeah, I'll talk to you tomorrow. This is Gershwan with One Mind Syndicate, signing out.
Always used to put my freedom first in any situation.